New York City, a Saturday morning in July 1928, 20 minutes before 9. Arthur Whitcomb, 34, an insurance clerk from Yonkers, stood at the foot of Desbrosses Street with his wife Louise and their 2 children, in a crowd already 300 deep, waiting for the gangway of the Hudson to open. Moored at the neighboring piers sat the black hulls of the transatlantic liners the Day Line shared this stretch of waterfront with, ships bound for Southampton and Cherbourg, dwarfing the white-hulled steamer his family had come to board. Arthur had not chosen the transatlantic liners. He had chosen the 9 o'clock boat to Kingston Point, the same boat, the same 9 o'clock departure, for the 3rd summer running. And he had never once explained to Peter and Nora why the 9 o'clock crossing mattered more than the later one, which cost the same $1 and reached the same landing by supper time. Peter, 8, already knew where he wanted to stand once the gangway crowd thinned onto the open deck, the forward rail on the starboard side, the spot his father always let him claim first, the one from which, if you looked back at exactly the right moment as the boat swung out into the river, the whole skyline seemed to tilt and recede at once. Nora, 6, held her mother's hand and watched the gangway attendants working the crowd forward in practiced waves, families sorting themselves toward the ticket windows, a boy nearby selling that morning's paper to men who would read it and forget it before Yonkers had even passed on the eastern shore. Arthur checked his watch. 10 minutes. He had told Louise, the first summer they made this trip, that the 9 o'clock boat was simply more convenient, closer to breakfast, less waiting once they arrived at Kingston Point. He had never told her, because he had never entirely worked it out himself, that the 9 o'clock boat was the one that cleared the battery just as the shipboard orchestra began its first set, and that some part of the whole morning, the wait, the crowd, the transatlantic hulls beside them, the single $1 bill folded in his coat pocket for each ticket, existed, for Arthur Whitcomb specifically, to arrive at the exact moment that music started. What had Arthur Whitcomb built, without ever naming it even to himself, into the particular hour before that orchestra began? And what did a family need from a river crossing that the transatlantic liners moored beside them, bound for places the Whitcombs would never see, could never give them at all? What the Whitcombs boarded that morning was not simply a boat. Dayline steamers of this era were built and outfitted specifically to be called floating palaces, and the description was not advertising exaggeration so much as an accurate account of what a passenger actually found aboard. Dining rooms finished in polished mahogany, as many as 14 separate parlors, including a dedicated ladies' parlor, a promenade deck roughly 1/7 of a mile in circuit, and a live orchestra whose sound could reach 3,000 passengers standing within earshot on the open decks. A single excursion ticket to Kingston Point cost about $1, within reach of a Yonkers insurance clerk's family of 4, which was precisely the point. The Day Line had built its identity, from its earliest decades, on carrying passengers only, no freight, and on keeping the base fare low enough that the trip functioned as an ordinary Saturday rather than a special occasion requiring special saving. For families who wanted more than the open deck and the view, a second, smaller economy operated on board. $1 bought the crossing, but $2 more bought a seat in the dining room, at a table set with crisp linen and silver plate, where a boy could order chicken croquettes or broiled bluefish and watch the Palisades go by from behind a window instead of a rail. Arthur Whitcomb had never paid the $2. He kept his family on deck, at the rail, with a lunch Louise had wrapped that morning. And this, too, was a choice, repeated every summer, that he had never explained. The dining room was for people who wanted the river as scenery. Arthur wanted his children at the rail, in the wind, close enough to the water to feel the boat's speed, rather than watch it through glass. The 9-hour run to Albany, by the Day Line's own accounting, was divided almost exactly in half at Poughkeepsie. The same clock, the same halfway point, that Arthur had once ridden past as a boy himself, on a longer version of the same crossing his own father had chosen. What did a boat built this deliberately, orchestra, dining room, dollar fare, open rail, actually require of a family in exchange for the trip? And what did the Whitcombs' particular choice, deck over dining room, tell us about what they had come aboard the Hendrik Hudson to get? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American excursion boat trip between 1900 and 1980. What the steamer or the dayliner or the coastal tour boat actually offered, what the crew and the regular passengers built into the trip over years of repetition, and what families were actually getting from 2 hours on the water that the destination on either end could not give them alone. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a steamer. The documented social meaning of a trip that a generation of American families built into their summers on purpose. Even if you never boarded a dayliner yourself, the specific thing it gave a family, an unhurried hour that belonged to nothing but the water and the view, is something almost no form of modern travel is built to offer anymore. And if your family took a river excursion like this, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take a boat like the Dayline? And do you remember which spot on deck was always yours? Next time on this channel, the Great Lakes steamer that carried Detroit's summer crowds to an island amusement park for 60 straight years. By 11:30, the Hendrik Hudson was passing Poughkeepsie, the Dayline's own documented halfway marker on the 9-hour run to Albany, though the Whitcombs, bound only for Kingston Point, had barely a third of that distance left. Peter had not moved from the forward rail in 2 hours except to eat. He had learned, the way children learn things by repetition rather than instruction, that the river changed character in stages. The crowded, businesslike stretch past the city, the long open reach past the Palisades, where the cliffs rose sheer enough that his father had to tilt his head back to see the top, and now this wider, calmer water, dotted with sailboats and framed by wooded shoreline, and the occasional grand estate visible above the tree line. Louise pointed out Vassar College's buildings, just visible from the water near Poughkeepsie, and told Nora that young women went to school there, a fact that meant nothing to a 6-year-old and everything to a mother who had not gone to college herself. This was one of the specific things the Dayline route was built to do. The boat did not simply carry passengers past scenery, it carried them past a documented sequence of named storied landmarks, old Dutch estates, the highlands ahead, the ruins on Bannerman's Island, West Point's gray buildings above the river bend. Each one a small lesson a parent could hand a child without ever calling it a lesson. Arthur had made this same trip as a boy, on a longer version of the crossing, all the way to Albany with his own father, sometime before the war. He remembered almost nothing specific about Albany itself. What he remembered, precisely and completely, 30 years later, standing at nearly the same spot on nearly the same kind of boat, was the particular color the water turned near Poughkeepsie on a clear July afternoon, and the sound the paddle wheels made changing rhythm as the boat slowed slightly for the turn in the channel. He had never told his father this was what he remembered. He suspected, standing there now with Peter beside him, that his father had known anyway. What was it about this specific, repeatable middle stretch of river? No dramatic view, no famous landmark directly ahead, simply water and shoreline and the particular sound of the engine, that fixed itself so precisely in a passenger's memory, more permanently than the destination at either end of the trip. The Hendrik Hudson made her landing at Kingston Point a little after 1 in the afternoon, and the Whitcombs disembarked into a 12-acre riverside park built specifically around the Dayline's passenger traffic, a documented destination purpose-built for families exactly like theirs. Kingston Point Park had shaded lawns and winding brick paths, a bandstand where a park orchestra played through the afternoon, a small artificial lagoon for rowboats, a carousel, a Ferris wheel, and a dance pavilion. All of it, by explicit park policy, free of alcohol, designed from its founding to be a place a family could turn loose in without supervision anxiety. Peter wanted the rowboats. Nora wanted the carousel. Arthur wanted more than either, simply to sit on the grass in the shade with Louise, while the children ran toward whichever attraction won the argument, and to notice, the way a man notices something only once he's had the same thought several summers running, that the 2 hours on the boat had done something to all four of them that the park itself, however pleasant, could not have done on its own. The children had arrived at Kingston Point already loosened, already easy, in a way that a drive straight from Yonkers would not have produced. The boat had used up some of the ordinary tension of a Saturday before the destination even began. This was, in fact, close to the park's entire commercial logic. Kingston Point Park existed because the boat existed. The boat's owners had built and then purchased the park specifically to give Dayline passengers somewhere to land, and the park in turn gave the Dayline a reason for families to buy the ticket in the first place. Neither the crossing nor the destination was really complete without the other, a fact the Whitcombs understood perfectly well without ever needing it explained, the same way Arthur understood, without being told, that his own father had chosen this destination for reasons beyond the carousel. What did a family actually get from the specific sequence? 2 hours of unhurried water first, then a landing built entirely around families like theirs, that a shorter, more direct route to the same rides and rowboats never could have given them. The boat back to Manhattan left Kingston Point a little before 6, and this crossing, the Whitcombs had all learned without discussing it, was a different trip from the mornings. The light changed the water from the flat working brown-green of midday into something with more gold in it, and the crowd on deck thinned into pairs and small groups rather than the morning's dense boarding crush. Families spent, contentedly, the specific way children go quiet after a full day rather than a short one. Nora fell asleep against her mother within the first half hour. Peter stayed at the rail, but differently now, watching the shoreline recede rather than approach, doing the same thing in reverse without it meaning the same thing at all. The boat's whistle sounded as it cleared Kingston Point, the same signal it had sounded departing Manhattan that morning, and Arthur noticed, the way he noticed most things about this trip only in the noticing, never in advance, that the sound meant something entirely different now than it had at 9 that morning. In the morning, the whistle had meant the day was beginning. Now it meant, with a specificity no calendar or clock could quite capture, that a particular, finite, already completed thing had just ended, and that the version of the day still ahead of them, the walk from the pier to the train, the ride home to Yonkers, Monday's return to the insurance office, belonged to an entirely different, less vivid category of time. Arthur had never once, on any of these summer trips, felt the return leg as merely the same crossing in reverse. He had come to understand, slowly and without ever stating it to himself in these terms, that the boat trip's actual shape was not a there-and-back line, but something closer to a single held breath, held on the way out, released, gradually, gently, unmistakably, on the way back, and that this specific, unhurried release, the one thing a family could never quite get from any faster or more direct way home, was very possibly the entire reason the trip mattered as much as it did. What did the whistle mean to Arthur Whitcomb on the return crossing that it could never have meant to a family driving the same distance by road? And what, precisely, is lost when the return itself is no longer a specific, felt, unhurried part of the day? Before you can understand exactly why Arthur Whitcomb chose the 9 o'clock boat and never the later one, you need to understand what competition among Hudson River steamboat operators had built into the very structure of the Dayline schedule. By the 1920s, the Dayline was not the only option on the river. Night boats ran the same route on an overnight schedule for travelers who wanted to arrive at Albany rather than experience the crossing. But the Day Line had built its entire identity on the opposite premise, that the 9-hour run between New York and Albany, timed with Poughkeepsie as the documented halfway point, was itself the product, not merely the delivery mechanism for one. Competing operators tried to match the Day Line's amenities, the dining rooms, the orchestras, the promenade decks, but the Day Line had gotten there first and biggest, with, at its 1925 peak, 7 active steamers moving more than 2 million passengers in a single season. None of this was visible to Peter or Nora standing at the rail. It was visible to the crew. The captain, who had likely run some version of this same crossing for years, and knew, without needing to check a chart, exactly where the channel narrowed near Bannerman's Island, and exactly how the tide behaved at Poughkeepsie on a given afternoon. The pursers and cabin stewards who recognized, summer after summer, the same families making the same trip on the same weekend without ever needing introductions. The orchestra, hired for a whole season, whose set list by late July had become, to the crew, if not the passengers, a familiar and slightly worn routine. This was the specific, invisible machinery underneath the Whitcomb's Saturday, a scheduling war between competing steamboat lines that had, indirectly and without either side intending it, produced the exact 9 o'clock departure and orchestra timing that Arthur Whitcomb had, without ever articulating why, built an entire family ritual around. What did it mean for the Whitcombs and for a whole regional economy of dock workers, ticket sellers, and crew, that an ordinary family's most treasured Saturday of the summer existed only because 2 or 3 competing steamboat companies had spent decades trying to outschedule each other? The Whitcomb's 1928 crossing sat near the very top of the Day Line's documented history. The peak year of 1925 was recent. The fleet of 7 steamers was intact. Ridership was near its all-time high. What Arthur could not have known, standing at that rail with Peter beside him, was how quickly the specific world that made this trip so effortless would begin to change. The hard economic years of the 1930s cut deeply into ridership as a through carrier to Albany. Families who had once budgeted $1 apiece for a Saturday excursion now budgeted that dollar more carefully, or not at all. The Day Line saw a brief, genuine upsurge in business during the Second World War as gasoline rationing and travel restrictions made a boat trip newly practical rather than merely pleasant. But the upswing did not last past the war's end. By the late 1940s, steamboat travel itself had begun, in a way it had never been in 1928, to feel old-fashioned, a documented shift in how Americans understood the trip, not simply a decline in its convenience. Automobiles were faster, more flexible, and increasingly affordable. Roads were improving year over year, and a family no longer needed to build a Saturday around a fixed 9 o'clock departure when a car could leave whenever it was ready. On September 13, 1948, the steamer Robert Fulton made the Day Line's last full run from Albany to New York City, the specific documented end of regular, through service between the two cities that had begun, in steamboat form, all the way back with Robert Fulton's own Clermont in 1807. The company did not disappear entirely. It was sold to new owners, and a shortened service resumed running only as far north as Poughkeepsie. Arthur Whitcomb's old halfway point had become, almost exactly, the new terminus. The company changed hands again in 1962, absorbed into the Circle Line's harbor and sightseeing operations. One steamer, the Alexander Hamilton, kept a version of the route alive longer than any other vessel in the fleet's history, carrying passengers into the 1970s on a route that had once, in the Whitcomb's summer, run confidently all the way to the state capital. What does it mean that the specific trip Arthur Whitcomb built an entire family ritual around, reliable, affordable, unquestioned, began its documented decline within 20 years of the very summer he was standing at that rail, and that neither he nor his children could have known it at the time? Peter Whitcomb drove his own children to Kingston for the first time in 1957, the year the new stretch of highway made the trip from Yonkers a straightforward hour and a half by car. The drive was faster than the boat had ever been, ran on his own schedule rather than a printed timetable, and cost him nothing beyond gasoline and the toll. He did not think, that first year, about his father's old 9 o'clock boat at all. There was no reason to. The highway did everything the boat had done, and did it in less time. What the highway gave Peter Whitcomb: a fixed hour and a half instead of most of a day, a parking lot instead of a gangway crowd, a trip that needed no schedule, no ticket, no orchestra, no dining room upcharge, and no dependence on a company's decision to keep running the route at all. What it did not give him: a rail his own son could claim before any music started. A whistle that meant, with total unambiguous clarity, that the ordinary part of the day had ended and the remembered part had begun. A halfway point at Poughkeepsie that structured 2 hours of unhurried, purposeless watching into something that stayed fixed in a passenger's memory 30 years later, more vividly than almost anything else about that particular summer. Peter Whitcomb did not know, driving north in 1957, that this was what the boat had been giving his family every summer of his own childhood. He came to know it, decades later, the first time his own son asked, entirely reasonably, why they didn't just fly somewhere instead, and found that he had no good answer beyond a feeling he could not fully explain, tied to a sound and a rail and a particular quality of light on the water near Poughkeepsie that no highway, however fast, had ever been built to provide. The rail had known what to do with a child standing at it for 2 unhurried hours. No one had thought to ask the highway to. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the American excursion boat trip meant to the families who chose it summer after summer, subscribe. There are more steamers, more river crossings, more evening cruises, and more crowded docks that were the best 2 hours of somebody's whole summer, and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. Even if you never rode a dayliner yourself, what it gave a family, an unhurried hour belonging to nothing but the water and the view, is something almost no form of modern travel still offers. And if you have a memory of a steamer, a whistle, a rail you claimed every summer, a crossing you still remember in specific physical detail, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take a river excursion like the Dayline? And do you remember which spot on deck was always yours? Next time, the Great Lakes steamer that carried Detroit's summer crowds to an island amusement park for 60 straight years.